Hi everyone, this is Jerem Norvan, host of the GGV Publishing Podcast. Welcome to the official first episode of this podcast, and it's a subject of history. Today we're going to talk about how the 13 American colonies were created by private corporations. And this is important because most people know that, yes, the United States had 13 colonies all the way from New England going to the south, but people did not know how these colonies came to being. So the goal here is to give you the knowledge, the historical background behind the formation of these colonies. So we know that the British government and private companies within Britain established many of the 13 colonies, right? So the British colonies of North America were either corporate colonies or proprietary colonies. So what are these colonies? So we have New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So all the entire East Coast from pretty much New Hampshire to Georgia. So the way it worked was that the king granted joint stock companies such as the Massachusetts Bay Company a royal charter to establish a colony. So a charter was a set of rules that allowed for self-governance. And corporate colonies were essentially corporations formed to make money for investors, the same way we have corporations today. So the 13 English colonies began as either corporate colonies or proprietary colonies. Proprietary colonies were owned by an individual proprietor or by a small group of proprietors under a charter from the monarch, so from the king. So, what's important to understand here is that under the proprietary system, the crown granted commercial charters to individuals or companies to establish overseas colonies. And these proprietors were then granted the authority to select the governors and other official in the colony. So we see here the indirect administrative rule of British colonialism. So it's always about uh, basically creating a transactions. British colonialism was pretty much transactional, and I find that very interesting compared to the French colonial style that was more social. It was about transforming the individual that they were colonizing, whereas the British, they didn't care about transforming the people they were colonizing. On the contrary, they say, hey, you guys have the right to govern yourself the way you want, so long as what you guys are doing is making money for the crown. So it was all transaction. So King James the First, who led Great Britain from 1603 to 1625, granted corporate charters for the settlement of Virginia, found in 1607, and Massachusetts in 1620. Massachusetts and other New England colonies had corporate charters and a great deal of administrative freedom. Right? So the first successful colony was at Jamestown in 1607, and it was established by a joint stock company, which was the London Company. So now I'm going to talk about the role of corporations in the formation of those colonies. So, what role did corporations play in the formation of the 13 colonies? So, the corporations that were granted charter were called joint stock companies. So a joint stock company is a type of business entity where ownership is divided into shares, which can be bought and sold by shareholders. So technically, it's what we have today, corporations. When you hear companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, they're all corporations because they have shares, and the owners of these shares are called shareholders. So each share represents a portion of the company's ownership, and the shareholders' voting rights and profits are proportionate to the number of shares they hold. So here are some key points about the joint stock company. So first, capital is raised by selling shares to investors instead of relying on a single owner or a small group of partners. So that would be more like an LLC, right? Like a single owner, small group of partners. So it would be an LLC or a partnership. But a corporation, any person that owns shares in that corporation is a shareholder, technically is an owner of the company. So this allows the company to access a much greater or a much larger pool of capital. Second, each share represents ownership in the company and voting rights in the company's decision, like electing a board of directors. And third, shares can be easily bought and sold, usually on a stock exchange, allowing shareholders to easily enter and exit the company. So, usually, when you see shares being bought and sold on a stock exchange, it's called a secondary market. So it's important to understand that several colonies were found by joint stock companies, private ventures granted royal charters by the English crown. And these companies aim to generate profit for their investors through exploration, resource extraction, or trade. So the Virginia Company, for example, which was responsible for Jamestown, and the London Company behind the Plymouth Colony are prime examples. So some companies like the Masonian proprietors, they were the one that formed New Hampshire, focused primarily on acquiring, then selling large tracts of land for profit. So that leads us now to land speculation, because land speculation was the asset of the day back then. People who were landowners, they were part of what we call the gentry, the American gentry. They were the upper class. Being landowner was had many advantage. So let me talk a little deeper about land speculation, right? So the primary driver for land speculation was the potential for significant financial gain. By acquiring land cheaply and then selling it at a higher price later, speculators hope to amass a significant amount of wealth. And this was particularly attractive during periods of westward expansion as new territories open up for development. And beyond the profit motive, owning large tracts of land granted not only wealth but a social status and political influence. It's important to understand that landowners often held positions of power in colonial governments and could shape policies to their advantage. So, yeah, people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, uh, Alexander Hamilton, all these guys that we call the founding fathers were landowners. They were very wealthy. So in the 1740s, a group of wealthy Virginians formed the Vandalia Company with the goal of acquiring a vast territory between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. They lobbied the British government for a land grant but faced strong opposition from from Native American tribes and the British Crown, ultimately leading to the company's demise. So throughout the colonial period, various land grab acts were passed, granting large tracts of land to individuals and companies. These acts often benefited speculators at the expense of Native Americans and small farmers who were displaced from their traditional lands. So that was one of the issues of the 13 colonies, is that it created a massive displacement of Native Americans and even some of the yeoman farmers, right? So the yeoman farmers that were already established on the East Coast, they were fine, but for the one that were in more in the inland side of the United States, so Ohio, so pretty much the Midwest, and more toward like Kentucky, Arkansas, and Mississippi and Alabama, those places, they were pretty much displaced because the population was growing significantly on the East Coast, right? So, in fact, between 1625 and 1775, the colonial population grew from 2,000 people to 2.4 million people as a result of that displacement. So, of course, this fueled conflict between colonies and Native Americans and contributed to the ongoing process of colonization, right? And one thing to also mention is that the concentration of land ownership in the hands of a few speculators create, of course, massive social inequalities. Small farmers and tenant farmers struggle to compete with wealthy landowners, leading to economic hardship and resentment. So you guys see that economic inequalities exist way before capitalism. It wasn't just capitalism that creates inequality. At that time, I'm talking about the colonial America. Before the American Revolution, it was mercantilism. And mercantilism was not a system of equality, although it had massive government intervention in that system. So, one thing to mention is that in the 18th century, the British government operated under a policy of mercantilism, right? So, in which the central government administered its colonies for Britain's economic benefit. And the British policies, such as the proclamation of the 1763, which restricted westward expansion, clashed with the interests of land speculators, because land speculators want to acquire more land to increase their wealth. So these tensions contributed to the growing discontent among colonies and ultimately helped spark the American Revolution. So the 13 colonies had a high degree of self-governance. So that was one of the major benefits of British colonialism. So the style of British colonialism. And they have like active local elections. And they resist London's demand for more control over them. And during the 1750s, the colonies began collaborating with one another instead of dealing directly with Britain. And with the help of colonial printers and newspapers of the time, these intercolonial activities and concerns were shared and led to call for protection of the colonies, the right as Englishmen, especially the principle of no taxation without representation. So conflicts with the British government over taxes and rights led to the American Revolution, in which the colonies worked together to form the Continental Congress and raise the Continental Army. So it's absolutely fascinating to me to see how the 13 colonies of British America came to be. And of course, after the American Revolution, these companies were pretty much dissolved, right? Because that's when the United States was formed, and therefore these companies were no longer relevant to maintain to maintain and exert their power over those colonies, because now it became the United States of America. That means that these colonies now became independent colonies, independent of the crown. They get to administer their own laws that did not depend anymore on the crown, and they did not have to do things for the crown. It was for the republic, and the constitution was then written to ascertain that independence. So that's what this episode was about. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you guys for the second episode of this season.